All right, today we are diving into one of those questions that has puzzled people for, well, centuries. But this isn't going to be just a philosophical chat. We're actually going to look at decades of serious academic research. We're talking thousands of cases that really make you question what we think we know about memory, consciousness, and what happens when we die.
I mean, this is the big one, isn't it? Have we lived before? In a different body? In a totally different time? It sounds like something straight out of a movie, but what if I told you there's a whole body of scientific data that suggests maybe it's not so far-fetched?
So, before we get any deeper, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. When we say reincarnation, we're talking about the idea that our consciousness, the thing that makes you you, doesn't just flicker out when we die. Instead, it gets reborn into a new life. Okay, now let's see where the evidence actually takes us. Our investigation really kicks off with what is, hands down, the most compelling and scientifically studied evidence out there. These documented cases of really young kids who seem to remember a past life with just stunning accuracy. The main person we need to talk about here is Dr. Ian Stevenson. And this is so important. He wasn't some fringe mystic. He was a credentialed psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who decided to apply real academic rigor to these wild claims because he knew how huge the implications would be if any of this held up. And the scale of his work is it's staggering. Over 4 decades, Stevenson and his team meticulously investigated and documented over 3,000 cases. 3,000! All involving children from all over the world who just started talking about memories of past lives. And Stevenson's approach wasn't just collecting stories. No way. He had this really strict, multi-step process. First, he'd write down everything the child said, names, towns, how they died, before trying to verify anything. Only then would his team go out and try to find a deceased person whose life actually matched all those details. And then they'd go interview that person's family to check every single claim.
So his whole body of work really stands on these 3 pillars of evidence. First, you've got those specific verifiable statements. Second, these unexplained phobias or behaviors, like a kid who's terrified of water and claims they drowned. And third, and this is maybe the wildest part of all, physical birthmarks that seemed to line up perfectly with fatal wounds.
So let's look at a modern case, one handled by Stevenson's successor, Dr. Jim Tucker. There was this little boy, James Leininger, who was having these awful nightmares about being in a fiery plane crash. He kept saying he was a pilot, that he'd been shot down by the Japanese, and get this, he named his ship the Natoma Bay, and even another pilot. His parents, totally baffled, started looking into it, and through old military records, they verified every single one of those obscure details. And this brings us to what a lot of researchers think is the most powerful physical evidence. In hundreds of cases, Stevenson found kids with really unusual birthmarks or birth defects that matched exactly the fatal wounds recorded in the autopsy reports of the people they claimed to be. We're talking about things lining up with specific injuries, like the entry and exit wounds of a bullet. It's pretty hard to explain away. Now, while Stevenson's work brought this modern scientific lens to the topic, the idea of reincarnation itself is not new at all. In fact, it's an idea that's been woven into human history for literally thousands of years. I mean, this belief is ancient, and it's everywhere. You see it with philosophers in ancient Greece, like Plato. It's the absolute foundation of Hinduism's concept of samsara, that great cycle of rebirth. It's central to Buddhism, to Sikhism. So this isn't some fringe idea. For billions of people, for thousands of years, this has been a core belief about how life and death work. Okay, so we've got this deep well of historical belief and decades of these academic case files. But a real investigation has to look at the counter-arguments, right? How does conventional science try to explain these incredible stories? The number one psychological explanation is something called cryptomnesia. Basically, it's where your brain soaks up information, maybe from a documentary you half-watched or a conversation you overheard, and just files it away. Then, months or years later, that memory pops back up, but you have no idea where it came from. So your brain says, hey, this must be my own memory. Then there's its close cousin, confabulation. Our brains are natural storytellers. They hate leaving gaps. So when a memory is incomplete, the brain just fills in the blanks. It might unconsciously invent details to make the story feel whole and make sense,
So a kid might remember seeing a picture of an old airplane, and their mind spins that tiny seed of memory into a whole, vivid story of flying that plane. To them, it feels 100% real, even though it's a mix of fact and invention.
And finally, you absolutely can't discount the power of the environment. Imagine you're in a family or a culture that already strongly believes in reincarnation. A child might say something simple, like a fantasy about being a soldier, and then through leading questions from well-meaning adults, that simple fantasy could slowly be shaped into a very detailed past life story that fits what everyone around them expects to hear.
Okay, so after looking at all the academic research on one side and these pretty powerful psychological explanations on the other, where do we land? What's the big takeaway here? So where does all this leave us? Well, you can really see the tug of war. On one side, you have a really compelling set of data. Thousands of cases, super specific details that get verified, and that deeply weird phenomenon of the birthmarks matching up with fatal wounds. But on the other side, you have these plausible scientific explanations for how our own minds could create these kinds of stories.
And that brings us to what is probably the most honest conclusion we can reach. The work of Stevenson and Tucker does not prove reincarnation in a way that would satisfy, say, a physicist, but it absolutely presents a genuine, persistent anomaly, a set of data that conventional explanations really struggle to fully account for, especially when you look at the strongest cases. So ultimately, we're left not with a simple answer, but with a much, much deeper question. Regardless of whether you believe in reincarnation or not, this research forces us to ask, is our current understanding of consciousness, of memory, of how the brain works, is it actually complete? This data suggests there are still some really deep mysteries left to explore. And maybe that's the real takeaway.